Hello, BookTube. Welcome back. Uh, my plan for the Rambling Raconteur channel is eventually to mostly focus on discussing books and sort of what I took from them and what others might take from them, and any connections they might have to other books as I read them throughout the year. Since I'm just starting this in 2020 and I finished reading throughout 2019 a number of books, I thought what I'd do is make a couple of quick videos where I look at some of the books I really enjoyed reading, either for the first time or then books that I reread and had a different take on the second time I've read them. I've been reading quite a bit since high school, and really since I turned about 30, I started recognizing there were books that I reread that I really like and books that I reread that I appreciate much more or appreciate less, and kind of question why I valued them when I was reading them at 2022. There's probably some good reasons for that. Nevertheless, I thought I'd start by creating one of some books that I read for the first time in 2019, and there's a number that I want to discuss, so I'm just going to start with some that are in a sort of general fiction literature category. So in pseudo-chronological order from as I read them. One of the first I read was the first volume of Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann, the great German modernist. The first volume is The Stories of Jacob. I had read a couple of Mann's short stories, some of his letters and sort of essays or articles, and had never really understood what the big deal was about Mann. He's frequently listed as one of the top modernists, and yet what I found was that as I was reading this particular volume of his, I really, really enjoyed it. I found that he took the stories from Genesis, from the Old Testament, and just wove them into the fabric of sort of Bronze Age, Earth, and with astounding results. The ways in which he shows the different ways that cultures could interact throughout that sort of nomadic time period in modern day Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. How those different cultures were interacting, how their families interacted with each other and with religion, was really fascinating. It was extraordinarily well written. I've started The Magic Mountain a couple of times, and I kind of have to be in a particular mood to read 20th century modernists. I love them, but I have to be in a mood to read them and sustain through what that entails for me personally and emotionally and intellectually. And so I've never finished The Magic Mountain, but reading The Stories of Jacob really made me appreciate Mann. I feel much more confident that I will finish The Magic Mountain at some point. And it's one of those books I don't mind rereading the first 100 or 200 or even 300 pages of, because Magic Mountain is quite well written. So that was Stories of Jacob. The next book I read for the first time that was just astounding is The Glory of the Empire. And the subtitle is A Novel, a History by Jean d'Ormesson. This book is absolutely fascinating. If you have any interest in particularly the Byzantine Empire, but the Roman Empire as well, and history or sort of adventure writing in general, this book is maybe one of the 3 or 4 books that I read this year that I know I'm going to reread in the next 5-10 years and love just as much, that I can't wait to share with my daughters when they're older. That'll be in about 15 years, but when they're older and can appreciate it. This book was fascinating because it's about a fictitious empire. It's a history written about a fictitious empire that's never existed on Earth, with characters that have never existed. But they've existed, and especially if when you've read a little bit about Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, however you want to phrase it, this book makes a lot more sense. I would recommend just even John Julius Norwich's A Short History of Byzantium, which is about 300 pages, before reading this, because you'll appreciate it much more. This is a very, very funny book. There are characters who, though, are pastiches of real Byzantine emperors who did either horrifying or amazing things. There are dynastic struggles. But it's all written with this very particular sense of humor. Another book I read for the first time this year was Persuasion by Jane Austen. I read about one Jane Austen novel a year. I have for the past few years. This is a shorter one. I believe it's a later novel of hers. It was enjoyable. It There were far fewer characters than there are in some of her novels, and I think that allowed me to appreciate some of her writing style a little bit better. The characterization that she does in a different way, because there weren't so many characters. I was able to just focus on a couple. So that was Persuasion. I picked up Complete Short Stories of Graham Greene, and I read the first volume. It's an anthology of all of his stories, but he did publish short story books, and so I read the first book from here, the 39 stories, first 39, and this is a good book. Graham Greene's a writer that I think will likely disappear in the 21st century. He's not as well read. Even though The Quiet American sort of had a resurgence, I think in my mind The Quiet American had a resurgence because of the parallels in some minds between the Vietnam War, which The Quiet American was very much like a piece of, and the modern, the Operation Iraq Freedom and the wars in Afghanistan, and the ways that U.S. foreign policy has reflected some of those Vietnam era policies. And I think Quiet American kind of had a resurgence, but I feel like his other novels are starting to disappear. My wife read Our Man in Havana for the first time and thought it was hysterical. And Graham Greene can be a very funny writer, and his stories really dig into that. They're all pretty much set in England in sort of those 1940s, 1950s eras, and 1930s. But they're very precise. I would say Greene's a very precise writer, and he has a particular outlook on humanity. If you've read his novels and you like them, you'll like his stories. If you've read his novels and you found them a bit much, the short stories are a nice change of pace, because you're not sitting with 200 pages of his particular, somewhat cynical, jaded outlook on the world, fatalistic almost outlook on the world, and the stories are much shorter, more contained. Another book I read for the first time was A Lost Lady by Willa Cather, part of the Library of America volume. And I had read some Willa Cather in high school, I think was the last time I had read her. And a couple of different connections from other books I was reading, different books from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, kept referencing Willa Cather. And I thought maybe I should just break down and read one verse. So I read A Lost Lady. I really enjoyed it. Set in Nebraska, but it really deals with sort of that archetypal human relationships and the idea that we might think we know what's going on with others, but we never do, and how beautiful that can be, but also how tragic that can be. And so this I enjoyed much more than the Willa Cather books I'd read in school, and I'm looking forward to reading another book out of that volume. Maybe Death Comes for the Archbishop, not sure yet, but that was particularly well written. This next book is Zama by Antonio Di Benedetto. This book was fascinating. It was recently filmed 3 years ago, and it's set in colonial Paraguay. Not really. It's set in Argentina, and I believe the film was Argentine, but it is not. It's within the book itself. The setting is really what at the time was the frontier of Argentina, which is Paraguay. This was fascinating. It's very surreal almost. It was written, I believe, in the 1950s by a man who was very politically active in Argentina. And if you're aware of history, in the 1970s there was a junta. There were a number of issues that led to him sort of not getting quite maybe the recognition he could have with this novel. This, though, is a fascinating study in how there's a saying that we're the heroes of our own story, And Zama perhaps gets at that idea better than any other book I read this year, which is the idea that we as humans tell ourselves myths that we operate from. And within the stories that we have around our own lives, around the choices we make, around the actions we make, around the tough choices we make, we have a tendency to remember those as a narrative that makes us a hero. Even when we do something we know is wrong, if someone was in our shoes, they would know that we were doing the right thing in that context. And Zama sort of gets at that idea and sort of peels it back to show that sometimes those myths are terrifying. And the myths we tell ourselves, the history in which we are the hero, is really quite horrifying. And it deals with a colonial officer in the frontier of Argentina who is sort of just falling apart. He wants to move to a more well-paid post in Buenos Aires, and he sees others successful around him, but he himself is not really successful. And we just gradually watch him ultimately go on an expedition into the Amazon to find a bandit, and the horrors that ensue when people who were only kept in a sense of camaraderie or society by the strictures of that society, when that structure is stripped away, what remains? And Zama really gets at that. And it's very short. It was about 200 pages, but fantastic novel. And then another book, also from the New York Review, NYRB Classics collection, was A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. And this is very short. I would almost call it a novella. I think it's about 130 pages. Deals with a man who, after World War I, he's suffering from some shell shock. He goes into northern England, into the countryside, where there's an old church, and his job is to restore a painting that existed many years ago, medieval time. He's part of the beauty of the book is you find out how they date some of those paintings, dealing with specific fashions that exist within the paintings. And he's there trying to strip away whitewash that had covered up this painting in this tiny little chapel that nobody, they're it's not like an active church where there's a lot going on. There is a minister there who kind of wants to leave, and this character is just gently, scraping away the whitewash, revealing what's underneath. And sort of as a parallel, as he does that, that's really not what the book is about. It's about him interacting with that tiny village that's there, with another World War I veteran who essentially lives in a makeshift trench that he dug to stay sane, who has another tiny job to find an old grave somewhere in that graveyard, near the church graveyard, to get a headstone. And they're both from the same bequest of a will. And it's a really fascinating study. It's particularly well written. There are sometimes those books that as you read them, you're understanding more about the English language and about how we use language to describe relationships and to describe the world in ways that we don't always find in other books. And so that was A Month in the Country. Extremely well written, very short. If you found it at a library, or I think I found mine at a used bookstore for $2 or $3, it was well worth reading. And then this final book was just all over the place. The Kremlin Ball by Curcio Malaparte. This is insane. I don't even know how to describe what this book was. I'm interested in reading more by this author, although I don't really like him. He apparently was a fairly active fascist at some point in Italy. He seems to have had a number of real issues, but then he was a communist, but then he renounced communism and became a fascist. He just seems to have been on the extreme ends of whatever spectrum you want to identify. But this book, this Kremlin Ball, is nonsensically incredible. it's set right as the great purges of Stalin are about to begin, and Trotsky is still alive, still in Russia. He hasn't been exiled yet, so I think it's 1928, 1929. But the purges are about to begin, and you can sense that feeling that everything's about to fall apart. That, you know, not just Europe is falling apart, which it is, but this sense that things are really going to fall apart in Moscow. That Stalin is unstable, he's paranoid, he's not really even a character in the novel, but there's just this sense of dread that exists. Characters are identified as, you know, walking about, and they know that they're kind of next to be publicly tried or exiled or shamed, and they just walk in, and there's a sense of like they smell of death because it's so horrifying. But it's written by a man who was a diplomat, and he was working with the attaché in the embassy, and he just seemed to have taken really hysterical notes. So there's great characterizations of all of these fascinating individuals who are seeing sort of the end of the dream of the Russian Revolution, which was really a nightmare for so many people, and especially the Russian peasants. But they're seeing the end of that dream, and this idea that there's going to be a new Russian aristocracy, but that aristocracy is now sort of what's on the chopping block. And so you see just the in the same sense you see the fiction that sort of right precedes World War One, right as those societies are about to just all fall apart and be wiped out. This book is almost a snapshot of late 20s Moscow with that same perception. And so if you really enjoy any of those, Ford Madox Ford, The Good Soldier, or I think there was some level of he had appreciated Proust, and so there's some Proustian ideas. The narrative's not like Proust at all. It's not stream of consciousness. It's not, you know, take a drink of something and just wander off mentally, which is fascinating. It's very different from that, but it has that sense of it's just like these pieces of the society, these snapshots of the society that form a little puzzle. And you're not going to get the whole puzzle, but what you do get is quite fascinating. And there's one other book I realized that I read this year for the first time that I neglected to mention. Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. Fantastic. Connected. It's set right there at the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And really deals with the sense of families and how generations within a family relate to each other, and how just as a society creates structure and sort of barriers that imprison individuals, that families can do the same thing. And I don't necessarily agree with all of that, but Radetzky March was particularly well written again. It's in that modernist phase, although it's set before World War One. It's written after World War One, in I believe the 1930s, and so it's very much of a piece with Thomas Mann. So those are some books I read this year. Just to recap: Stories of Jacob by Thomas Mann, Glory of the Empire, a novel of history by Jean de Ormesson, fantastic. Radetzky March by Joseph Roth, a triptych of NYRB classics, Zama, A Month in the Country, and The Kremlin Ball. And then some of the more, mainstream classics, Persuasion by Jane Austen, A Lost Lady by Willa Cather, and the first 39-ish stories of Graham Greene. So up next, some other books I read for the first time this year that are in more particular genres. Thank you, BookTube.